So, a warm welcome to you to our Bible talk this evening. It's a very topical subject, as our President has said, with the conclusion of the COP meeting in Glasgow just end of last week, wasn't it? Does anybody know what COP stands for? I think our President does, because if you listen very carefully, you might have given away the secret, but does anybody know what COP means? Nearly, Conference of Parties. And as is explained, this was the 26th meeting since they held their first meeting in 1995. And this meeting opened with little hope. Many were convinced that there was precious little time to save this earth from man's destruction. In fact, Boris Johnson says, we're at 1 minute to midnight to prevent climate catastrophe. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety, especially among young people, caused by climate warming. Now, the warnings that we've heard, we older ones have heard many times before. The United Nations itself has been very forward in putting forward warnings. Way back in 1972, it warned that the world had only got 10 years to sort the problems out. And then in 1982, it said, we've only got till the year 2000 before there'll be an environmental catastrophe as irreversible as any nuclear holocaust. And then in 1990, they were saying, we've only got till 1994 to fix change. You might be surprised, you younger ones, to know that when we were younger, it wasn't global warming, it was global cooling. In 1970, it was said that there would be a new ice age by the year 2000. And then following year, that got moved on, but to 2020. And in 1975, they were predicting, because of this change in the weather, the cooling of the weather, that there wouldn't be the crops grown, and there will be famines and great food shortages. And by 1978, they said there's no end in sight to this 30-year cooling trend. And then it switched. It was then global warming. And in 1988, we were told that the Maldives would be underwater by 2020. And in 2000, we were told that soon children wouldn't even know what snow is because of global warming. And in 2008, Al Gore famously said that the Arctic would be ice-free by 2013. And Prince Charles the following year said, we've only got 96 months to sort out and save the world. At the Paris Declaration, it was 3 minutes to midnight, and this fortnight ago, we're now at 1 minute to midnight. Now, we've heard an awful lot about computer modelling during this COVID period, and we know that rubbish in, you get rubbish answers out. And we've been faced with many predictions which have been totally way over the top, haven't they? Many high predictions of deaths and COVID cases which didn't come to light because of the poor information that was fed in. So it makes us just a bit wary of some of these predictions that are taken into account. And of course, the world doesn't take into account that the world is God's world. He is in control, and there are natural cycles of warming and cooling, all under the control of God. We know, for instance, from recent history that in the 17th to the 19th centuries, the River Thames regularly froze over for long periods. This is a drawing of the frost flare in 1683-84. And you can see the ice there is so thick that you can drive horses and carts on it. You can have stalls. They lit fires to keep themselves warm. And this was a regular occurrence. This Thames froze over for 2 or 3 months at a time. And I don't know how well you can see the line on there, but the 10-year averaging, which is the red line, we can see, yes, there has been about a 1 degree centigrade increase in nearly 400 years. Yes, the temperatures are getting warmer, But we see evidence of that in the melting glaciers. But what the melting glaciers reveal to us, that before the glaciers were there, the Earth must have been much warmer because there are forests there. And so in this picture here, there's a stump of an ancient tree which is now being revealed as the glacier retreats, showing that before the glacier came, there was a forest there. And trees have been dated going back to 2,000 years. And that was in Alaska. This too is in Alaska. And here's the remains of an ancient tree trunk. And you can see in the background new forest appearing. So obviously it was warmer, and went colder and is now getting warmer again. And there are many cycles that affect the weather. Sunspots is one of them. It's quite a shortish cycle, about 11-year cycle in the sunspots. Lower activity at the time when it was very cold, heightened activity slowly increasing. And there are other things that affect the weather. It depends on the volcanic activity. If there's a lot of volcanoes erupting, then the sulphur that's put into the atmosphere blankets the sun, causes cooling, and it have been periods in the earth when it has led to famine and shortage of food because of the volcanic eruptions. And the oceans are wonderful, we believe, a God-driven system of mixing the waters up so that the cold and the warm circulate round. And just depending how far El Nino moves towards the equator will depend the amount of rainfall in America. We know in the north we have the Gulf Stream, and depending just where the Gulf Stream ends up, to the north of Britain or to the south of Britain, will depend on whether it's drawing in cold air or drawing in warm air from the south. So there are many things that affect the weather. And so we're saying it's not necessarily global warming and man's activity, but that's not really our subject. What people are worried about, is there going to be a sustainable Earth for our children, for our grandchildren, for our great-grandchildren to enjoy? And we can say with complete confidence that there is an answer to these worries. Will there be a sustainable Earth? Well, who has the authority to answer that question? Well, there's one authority that we can trust, the one that brought the heavens and the earth into being and whose plan and purpose is being carried out. And the Bible emphatically tells us that the earth isn't going to be destroyed by man. God will not allow that to happen. And we're going to look at in our second part how God has the perfect solution. But in this first part, I want to see how man is responsible for many of the problems that the earth faces, and this affects the climate. Before we do that, we just need to know the role of CO2, and I add in that water as well, because both of those have a big effect on our climate. Water vapour acts like a blanket. And we can appreciate this, especially at night time. If it's a clear night, then we're going to have lower temperatures. If it's cloudy, then it's going to be warmer because that water vapour acts as a blanket to keep the heat in radiating off the earth. Well, that's what happens at lower levels. CO2 does the same job, but at much higher levels, way out into the atmosphere. And so again, the more CO2 there is up there, then the warmer the Earth will be. The less CO2, then the cooler the Earth will be. And what is so interesting is that this marvellous mechanism that God has built into the atmosphere, not only to provide the oxygen, the nitrogen, the carbon, all the things that are needed, is this carbon dioxide, which has a role in controlling the temperature of the Earth. And the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very small, 0.04%. 1 part in 2,500. and yet it plays a vital role. A man is said to be responsible for 3% of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Some people do go as far as to say 30%, but I believe that's greatly exaggerated. And as far as the United Kingdom is concerned, this country is responsible for 1% of that 3% of that 0.04. And so we in Britain are faced with much rising fuel bills and that in order to pay for this fear of global warming. But let's just see how man is responsible for so much of it. We all live in Rugby district. We're all aware that there's a new town on the east of the town of Rugby, and vast areas of grassland are being covered over with tarmac and concrete and bricks and mortar. Now, grass and trees play a very important role because they absorb carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. And man and animals need that oxygen and take in oxygen, and they give off carbon dioxide. So the more we destroy the God-given trees and grass which absorb CO2, then yes, we will be faced with more CO2. We will be faced with higher temperatures because these are houses. They're being heated. There are concrete. There are cars. And inevitably the temperatures will rise. Admittedly, trees are planted on these estates to offset the loss of the grassland, but they take time to mature. But in many areas of the world, man desecrates the forestry, cutting it down in order to grow short-term crops. And the trees are the real lungs of the earth, as I say, absorbing carbon dioxide and giving off vital oxygen, which animals and mankind needs. But for short-term gain, forests are being chopped down at an alarming rate. And this was one of the things that was talked about at COP, reducing the deforestation. And because these crops being grown are short-term, because they're not putting organic matter back into the soil, using fertilisers, using herbicides, the structure of the soil is rapidly depleted, and so after a while the crop yields go down, and so more forests have to be cut down. But that is man, because of his greed, cutting down the vital forests. And the extensive use today of herbicides. This keeps the fields nice and clean, no weeds grow. But then when there's heavy rain, there's nothing to help absorb the moisture, and it runs off and causes flooding. And again, with the dependence on artificial fertilisers, it depletes the ability of the soil to absorb water. And then there are then problems for mankind and for animals absorbing from these plants which have been sprayed herbicides which damage the health. So man is the problem of many of these problems. And even his solutions cause problems because the amount of energy that's required to build and construct these huge wind turbines and the huge amount of concrete that is needed to anchor them into position, they themselves generate an awful lot of carbon dioxide in the manufacture of the concrete and the steel and all the parts that go in. And of course, these massive structures are very expensive and are dependent upon heavy subsidies in order to make them viable. So they're great for firms who have got vast pockets and can invest vast sums of money. Not so good for people that live close to these huge turbines. I'm not talking about small ones, but these huge ones, if anybody has a house surrounded by them, the health problems that these cause with the constant hum and the constant flicker as the blades go through the sunlight, as it were, causes great problems. And you won't find wind farms in posh areas because the people club together and make sure that they're not built on their land. It tends to be in poorer areas of the country where these are built. And we know the problems that they cause for the birds. Many birds are killed by these rotating blades. I was just recently reading an article that where bats are around, the pressure caused by these blades, which can rotate at 200 miles an hour when they're really going round, if a bat flies in the vicinity of the tip of the blade, its own lungs just implode because of the pressure caused by it. So we see that man is responsible for a lot of the problems, but nevertheless, many people are fearful about global warming, and at COP26 there were many who demonstrated and pleaded for the governments to act before it was too late. So we looked at the current situation, we've seen man's fears, but there is a message of hope, and that's what our second part will show.